This segment will focus on fermentation, starting with primary fermentation, where most of your most vigorous activity takes place in the vessel that we racked our beer into from the boil pot yesterday. Secondary fermentation will take place as things start to slow down, and I will move the beer then into a new clean vessel and allow it to condition, and in that I will leave the heavy particulate matter and dead yeast from the primary fermentation behind, and hopefully start to clarify the beer. At this stage, for this IPA that I'm making, I will also be adding dry hops to it. So we'll cover all this in sequence as we go. So here we are, about 12 hours into the fermentation since I pitched the yeast. You can see a croissant starting to develop on the top. And in a second I'm going to switch the angle here, and we're going to look right in at the beer, and you're going to see the difference between now and then 12 more hours. When we look in, I don't know how well this is showing, but it looks pretty calm. The hops and the heavier stuff is settling toward the bottom. There'll be yeast slurry that'll form down there as well. The temperature, I pitched it at 60, and then I let it slowly come back up. As fermentation picks up, you're going to see a couple things. The temperature will increase, which for a home brewer isn't a big deal, but on a commercial scale, it's in large volumes, it's a big deal. And you'll see that the liquid, you're going to get a lot of activity in that liquid. So we'll check back in about 12 more hours. Here we are now, day and a half. Fermentation's going full tilt. Airlock bubbling like a piston. And you look down at the liquid. Look at all the turbulence. I'll keep it on here for a second. It kind of goes in waves around there and stirs up everything as the gases are being released. So that's a good fermentation. Use a starter, you get a good quick start to it. If you pitch yeast in a lower number, like straight from a vial, you will get a longer lag time, and that will change the flavor of your beer. It's acceptable to do it, but you will get a different flavor to your beer by stressing the yeast. I've pitched literally a packet of dry yeast into a 6-gallon batch of beer. It was in excess of 1200 gravity. It took 3 days to even get a croissant and get going, but it fermented and it tasted fine. So anyways, that's fermentation. That'll go like this for a day or so, 2 or 3 days, until it starts to slow down, and then that stuff will all settle to the bottom. Here we are. It's a little bit later on the same day. As you can see, that temperature is inching up a bit. 74. That's all right for a primary fermentation with this particular yeast, California ale yeast. Ramp that temperature up too much, and you start risking off flavors because of it. I'd rather see it somewhere around 72 or 70. So I'm going to actually move this fermenter downstairs in my basement where it's a bit cooler, and probably bring that fermentation temperature down a few degrees. And by the way, I'm only uncovering this thing for the pictures. You gotta keep this out of light. All that hops. It's the hops that will skunk if you leave a beer in a clear glass container in the light. So I keep this covered all the time when I'm not filming it. Alright, here we are a few hours later, and I'll let that focus. You can see I brought my temperature down to about 70. It's good. Having it in contact with the cement floor seems to really help. And that's where I'd like to keep things during the primary fermentation. And there's another nice view of the gas formation causing everything to swirl inside. It's really interesting. It's kind of fun to watch for me, actually. My wife, Mrs. Browbeater, seems to think it's a strange pastime, but it's part of the fun. So here's the idea for moving the primary fermentation into a secondary. I didn't show the whole agonizing process because there's not much to it. What we have in the fermenter, primary fermenter, is first off my siphon pump, a little bit of the beer left in it, and what I did, just give that a pump. You get things moving, put the other end of that into a nice clean carboy. As you notice, this is a smaller carboy with less headspace, and that's desirable. You would like to see that headspace filled with CO2, but sometimes the fermentation is essentially done, and you may not get as much CO2 in there as you hope. So I always like to move it as fermentation slows, but I want a little left in it, so that when I do move it, we'll take any potential O2 that's left in that and exchange that for CO2. Also, what you notice in the primary is the green shrub. That's hops. It's an IPA, so there's a lot of hops in there, and yeast, dead byproducts from yeast. And a yeast cake too. If that was clean, you could probably get by with pouring another batch of wort on that, and probably get a fermentation. Some guys do that. I don't. I just start fresh every time. And now you can see the ring where the kreuzen was as well. So now the job is to clean this all up and have it ready for the next batch. And we'll set this aside and let it, can't see it in there very well. I got all my hops in there too. I just stuck dry hops pellets in there, a little cascade, and we'll have a nice aroma to the beer. So we'll follow this up with bottling.